Okay, welcome everyone. Can you all hear me okay? Great. So thank you all for coming to the International Climate Policy Chat. We have a great discussion planned for this evening that will be led by Professor Sarah Hearn, and she will introduce our panelists for this evening. Professor Sarah Hearn teaches a class on making global governance work here at Wagner, and she also is a consultant to international organizations and is a co-founder of an initiative to promote constructive links between the UK, the EU, and the USA. She previously led senior positions in the British government, both DFID and FCO, the United Nations, and NATO. We are so lucky to have her both from ACE and IPPA, and on behalf of both student groups, we hope you enjoy this presentation. Definitely, if you have any questions, post them in the Q&A and we will do our best to answer them and field those questions to our panelists. So Sarah, thank you so much for your willingness to moderate the panel discussion, and we look forward to the discussion. Thanks.
Okay, Lexi, thank you very much for the introduction. So I'll introduce my fellow panelists and then just talk about the agenda. We have Professor Franz Baumann, who's a professor of international relations at New York University, an expert on climate change. He also has over 30 years of experience working in the United Nations, including as Assistant Secretary General, so a fountain of knowledge on the global system. And then we have Mara Dolan, who's an Advocacy and Policy Associate at the Women's Environment and Development Organization. And I'm really excited to hear what she has to say. She's got lots of fascinating ideas and fresh and innovative takes on climate change. So I'm looking forward very much to this discussion. For the agenda, I'm just going to speak very quickly about the Paris Accords and this current populist and nationalist challenge that we're experiencing to those accords, just to kind of set the scene. But I'll speak very quickly, and then I will be handing over to Franz Baumann and Mara Dolan for their presentations. Then we'll have some time for discussion as a panel, and then from 7 o'clock onwards, you'll have a chance to do Q&A. So as you have questions, feel free to put them in the chat, and then there'll be an opportunity to pose those questions to the panelists. So just very quickly, I was asked to just give, from 10,000 feet, what's the politics of climate change and the Paris deal specifically? Well, for those of you that might not be completely familiar with the Paris deal, this emerged in 2015 and 2016. It was really a major breakthrough. There have been many decades of attempts to get countries together on climate change and to agree to reduce carbon emissions. Actually, since the early 90s, this process has been going on. It's part of what's called the Conference of the Parties, which I think Professor Baumann might talk about a bit more. But the Paris negotiations were actually the 21st effort of countries to try and come together with a framework to really seriously tackle climate change. And it really emerged, I think, as a result of many decades of, domestic pressure, building multi-party consensus in countries, crucially building scientific consensus, which the UN was, I think, really instrumental in trying to pull together. And it's a voluntary framework for countries to reduce climate change to being below the 2 degrees Celsius higher than pre-industrial levels. And each country is supposed to set out in its nationally determined contributions what it will do voluntarily to tackle climate change. And that partly looks at, when their carbon emissions will peak, when they'll become carbon neutral, and what resources they're willing to put on the table to help themselves and other countries to adapt and mitigate to climate change. And I think a big thing about the Paris deal is that it was able to overcome some of the major political sticking points that had been really big problems before that moment in 2015 and 2016. And in particular, all countries agreeing to accept responsibility and to do what's within their capabilities. And essentially, what was most important was the US and China agreed to do so in advance of the Paris negotiations. And it also, I think, removed some of the sticking points around legal liability. Some of the industrialized countries didn't want language in there because they don't want multi-billion-dollar class action lawsuits. They don't want to be taken to the International Court of Justice. So developing countries back down on some of their demands for liability in exchange for resources and finances to help them adapt and prepare and drive towards new energy sources. But the rubber hits the road really when countries come up with their nationally determined contributions. That's when we see, does this really make a difference or not? And so far, almost 190 countries have ratified the framework, but the question is, what's next? And the eternal problem in global agreements is how do you deal with the free riders? And we have a very particular free rider problem now because of populists and nationalists who've emerged at the same time, who have used the Paris deal really as a bit of a lightning rod for their culture wars that they have initiated in various countries. So you probably know that President Trump withdrew from the Paris deal, and the USA is set to leave one day after the election in November. But it's a common trend. So Bolsonaro, president of Brazil, said that it's a UN conspiracy to steal Amazon sovereignty. Poland's been opposing progress inside the European Union. Even last year, a G20 summit climate statement on climate was watered down at the insistence of various oil-producing and gas-producing countries. So there are still major political challenges ahead. And of course, nationalists now, I suppose a big threat is they could be tempted to use high carbon measures to exit this economic crisis that we have as a result of COVID-19. So that short-termist mentality, I think, still poses a threat to all of us and to what we can do next, but it's not hopeless. So now we're in the run up to the Glasgow conference, which is COP, Conference of the Parties 26. So this is effort 26. Countries need to come with their nationally determined contributions. It's been moved to 2021 because of the pandemic, which isn't the worst thing, I would argue, because I think having the conference right after the US election would mean that it's all about the US election rather than, I think this gives countries an opportunity to prepare a bit more. And of course, there are some major announcements that we've had from the EU and China, which could be potentially very promising. And I can't wait to hear what the panelists have to say about that. So that sets the scene. But now I am going to hand over to Professor Baumann, who will explain to us about the UN global framework and global governance around climate change.
Thank you so much, Sarah, and good evening, everyone. You said it all, so I can pass over immediately to Mara Dolan, I think. No, kidding. No, it's a wonderful introduction. I would like to step back a little bit, but I end up exactly where you were, Sarah, namely with COP and with Paris. To understand the United Nations, it's important to understand the historical context. The term United Nations was coined by US President Franklin D. Roosevelt, who used it in 1942 in his New Year's Day Declaration of the United Nations to describe the World War II alliance of initially 26 states against the Axis powers, Germany, my country, Italy, Japan, Bulgaria, Croatia, Hungary, Romania, Slovakia, and Yugoslavia. So, the United Nations as an organization, sorry, I let it ring. So emerged as a utopian project out of the catastrophe of World War II, which was the Second World War in the space of a generation. In the 1920s, the opportunity was missed to organize peace. Japan invaded Manchuria, China. Italy invaded Abyssinia, Ethiopia today. Germany invaded Czechoslovakia and started World War II and carried out the genocide against the Jews. So after World War II, a new chapter was to begin. was very idealistic. It was breathtaking, namely that states would cooperate regardless of how big or powerful or rich or the opposite they were. This is the first time in history that former enemies would not be punished, but would be reintegrated into the civilized concert of nations. President Roosevelt emphasized that the creation of the United Nations heralded the end of a world order of unilateralism, military alliances, spheres of influence, and other instruments that had existed for centuries. The UN Charter was ratified by the US Senate by an overwhelming vote, 89-2. It would not be today, and it would be virtually impossible to convince 193 countries. In 1945, there were 51, to draft again a charter for the security of the earth. So the sheer numbers of countries, of issues, of differing capacities, of economies, of interests would simply not allow it. So one can be nostalgic about the post-World War II era of entrenched cooperation. As I said, it was the first time in history that victors did not seek revenge and thus did not plant the seeds for the next war. So the UN is the institutionalization of ongoing cooperation of all states, which reduces the anarchy in the international system. Cooperation is confidence building. So the UN embodies global cooperation, universally applicable norms, and the rule-based conduct of states. The UN is not an NGO. The UN is also not a charity. The UN is a system of states that works as long as states have shared interests. As regards climate, there were shared interests into the 1980s. In 1988, the UN General Assembly passed the first resolution on the dangers of global warming and called for action. It was pathbreaking. I have to show you a slide. Hang on. 2 months later, as you can see, can you see the slides? Time magazine made Earth, endangered Earth, the planet of the year. So there was the international community, but also locally, we were on a roll to tackle climate. It had not yet been politicized. It was a scientific issue. 3 years later, in Rio de Janeiro, the second UN Climate Earth Summit was taking place. The first was in Stockholm in '72. And out of it came what Sarah referred to, namely the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change that was to limit global warming. And Sarah mentioned COP21 was in Paris. COP1 was in Berlin. In 1995, this is the stamp of the German Post Office. Interesting, so this was 25 years ago. The secretary of this conference in 1995 was the then German Minister of the Environment, current Chancellor Angela Merkel. So, in 25 years, we have inched forward, and it shows in a way the strength of the UN, which is to establish norms, to draw attention to an issue, to create a framework. The UN has done more. In 1988, I mentioned that resolution. In 1988, wisely, phenomenally, spectacularly, the UN created the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. Thousands of scientists that review the best science around the world to report to political decision makers what the threats are, the damage, the dangers, and so on. So the IPCC, Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, is a child with two UN parents, the World Meteorological Organization in Geneva and the UNEP, UN Environment Program in Nairobi. So the UN is very good at drawing up roadmaps, like also the Agenda 2030 that I might talk about in the discussion. And so in Paris, the agreement was to limit warming to 1.5 degrees. And that was a major success because all the previous COPs did not work. Now, the bad news is that no single industrialized country is on target to meet the 1.5 degree commitments that countries have voluntarily entered into. European Union is making spectacular attempts with a Green New Deal, but that is still only being talked about. Russia is, Sarah, you mentioned that about 190 have ratified. Russia was one of the last a couple of months ago, but has absolutely no intention of plans to do anything about it. Russia is actually sabotaging the COP process. Now, China, interesting. 3 years ago, and it underlines the convening power of the UN, President Xi Jinping, on 22nd of September, spectacularly announced to the UN General Assembly that China aims to reach peak carbon emissions by 2030 and become carbon neutral by 2060. It raised a lot of questions. Was it a serious commitment or a geopolitical maneuver to outshine President Trump? Does it exempt China's financing of dirty energy projects in other countries? China is building power stations, coal, in Philippines, in Vietnam, in others. How will the world's largest emitter of greenhouse gases achieve such an ambitious goal, China? China today is still building new coal plants. Currently, 250 gigawatts of coal-fired capacity are under development in China. You don't know what 250 gigawatts are, but what that is more than all the coal plants of the US or India together. That is what is being planned. So it remains to be seen. If a country can do it, I think China will do it. But proof is in the pudding. Making an announcement is, you know, as the saying goes, the map is not the territory. So that will have to be seen. So, but the UN is hugely important as a norm setter and to monitor compliance. For example, UNEP issues every year since 2011 a gap report, the emissions gap report. It will come out in late October, and it maps in detail what the countries have committed to do and what that will add up to, and what is the gap to meeting the 1.5 degrees. Let me just get out of this again. So that is hugely important. So the IPCC, a UN institution, what UNEP is doing, what the Climate Change Secretary at UNFCCC is doing is hugely important, but it cannot ensure compliance because it cannot enforce. So the UN's core principle, cooperation, is one. Universality, namely that everybody, that not a single country has quit the UN and almost all are there. And sovereign equality. They are the strength of the UN, but they are also the weaknesses. And so we have a paradox that many global challenges are transcending borders, and not only global heating up, but pandemics, terrorism, drugs, organized crime, and they require a global response. But organizing, choreographing global responses is awfully hard because the problems are too complex, the countries are too different in terms of size, economies, capacities, and interests. Free riding, externalizing costs, Sarah not wanting to pay for the history of global warming, namely industrialization that has made Europe and North America rich. And then switching to, you mentioned it, America first, Russia first, Brazil first, Poland first, Hungary first, everybody else first. So we're having a crisis in the UN, and then I will stop. And that is that the three most powerful and the three most important countries in the UN and the Security Council, namely the US, Russia, and China, are violating their prescribed responsibility under the Charter of the United Nations. They are rule violators. They are pursuing national agendas. They're not doing what Article 24 of the Charter asks them to do, namely, they are given this in trust for the world. The Security Council is not a forum where they can push their national agenda, but they're doing it. So legal norms are fading, power politics are ascending, and great power politics are returning with a vengeance. Let me conclude by saying the UN, the shorthand of the UN is actually quite misleading. There is no such thing as the UN. There are at least two UNs, probably three. The first UN is the UN of member states, the General Assembly parliamentary process. The second UN, and that was by design, because it could not be assumed that member states in the General Assembly, with each country having one vote, would come up with decisions that are in the best interest of the world. Therefore, Article 100 of the Charter prescribes a strong, autonomous, and independent Secretary General and a strong Secretariat that is the anchor, the counterpoint, that is the only institution that keeps the interests of the world in mind. That's the theory, it's not the practice, I'm sure. So the UN has several elements, and you saw that a couple of days ago, the World Food Programme won the Nobel Peace Prize, which was exciting, wonderful, excellent, because that is another part of the UN, which is its operational arm, whether it's WHO, whether it is WFP, whether it is UNICEF, whether it is UNEP or World Meteorological Organization, about 30 specialized agencies. They do a lot of concrete work. They're not setting the norms, but they're doing lots of excellent work on the ground. Now, the Secretary General, of course, can also do more, leading by example, greening peacekeeping missions. That was a job I once had. The UN Pension Fund, for example, is 72 billion. I'm still waiting, I'm pushing, I'm nudging, I'm lobbying for the UN to announce that it will divest from fossil fuels and send a signal to the world. and do all kinds of things. But so the UN is a complex mechanism for global governance, and I'll stop here because my time is up. We can later talk about an offshoot, which is the Agenda 2030, namely the Sustainable Development Goals, which were promulgated within months of the Paris Agreement in December 2015. It is the same spirit, it is the same lofty ideals, and it's the same reality that the goals agreed upon are not being met, because charting a way forward is not actually the same as moving. Thank you very much.
Franz, thank you. That was a really excellent presentation. There's, I think, a huge amount to follow up and discuss. And so ask people, jot down your questions and we'll come back in the discussion. And now I would like to invite Mara Dolan to give your presentation. Thank you.
Thank you all. It's really great to be here, and I feel very honored to be able to share with you a little bit of my work and my organization's work and the work that we do in connection to movements. And thank you as well to Franz, who just went before me, for really setting the stage, I think, for a lot of the really important technical and political landscape that my presentation will also speak to from a little bit of a different perspective. So, by way of introductions, my name is Mara. I use she, her, or they, them pronouns, and I'm here representing the Women's Environment Development Organization, WeDo for short. And WeDo is an almost 3 decades old advocacy organization founded by a real powerhouse set of women's rights and environmental advocates and activists. And we've been working at the intersection of gender and climate justice ever since. And because our founding mothers, as we like to call them, were global advocates and rooted in global movements, and this included Bella Abzug, pioneering feminist congresswoman from New York, and was based here in the US, obviously, but also folks like Wangari Maathai and Vandana Shiva and others who were really rooted in movements in the global South. WeDo always inhabited this space of really trying to influence global policy processes by remaining rooted in global women's movements and transnational networks of feminist solidarity. So I don't really identify as a policy expert, but I think we see, as folks rooted within feminist movements, policy as one avenue to achieving change, and a really important avenue. I would also call global policy one of our tools. So I'm really happy to speak about global climate policy from that perspective. And as an organization that whose headquarters is based in the US, I'm here in New York as well, and who views part of our responsibility as deeply engaging with questions of what role the US has played in contributing to the climate crisis and inhibiting climate progress. We are constantly working to bridge this gap between US national climate discourse and work with the global policy work happening in the COP space, the Conference of the Parties, and other global policy spaces as well. So I'll speak to 2 kind of buckets of WeDo's work that sit at this bridge, or try to form the bridge, really. First, our work with the US Feminist Coalition for a Green New Deal. And then second, our work in feminist collectives at the UN climate negotiations. And I've sort of been asked by the organizers to speak really broadly about both of these buckets of work, but I'm happy to dive into sort of the details or specifics of what this entails later as well. But I'll try to be as useful with a broad overview as I can. So to start with the first, right, to start with the US. So WeDo is part of a broad and really powerful collective of organizations that make up the Feminist Coalition for a Green New Deal. And we all came together as organizations with the understanding that there can be no gender justice without climate justice. And the coalition came together in early 2019, as many of you will remember, when Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and Senator Ed Markey introduced the resolution for a Green New Deal in the US Congress. And I think a lot of folks will point to that moment, and as activists, we point to that moment as a real flashpoint of really incredible momentum and attention around what kind of transformative agenda could come in the next few years. So we came together in sort of the aftermath of that moment in early 2019, in recognition as well that all of us had powerful things to contribute, but that we're more powerful together, and that individualism is not a core tenet of feminism, and that we do things together or we don't do them at all. So the coalition consists of a really wide range of individuals and organizations who are working towards justice at all of the intersections that the climate crisis touches, and we know it touches them all. Migrant justice, racial justice, immigration justice, economic justice, labor justice, reproductive justice, and of course, gender justice. And if you're interested in sort of diving into who is in the coalition and what organizations are represented and what some of our most recent work is, feministgreenNewDeal.com is where you can find that. You can also sign up to find out more updates. And I would say the sort of top line understanding of our work is that we came together knowing that any feminist approach to climate policy must seek to combat and repair historical oppressions. It needs to advance a transformative feminist agenda that centers the leadership of women. It needs to address the generational impacts of colonization and anti-Black racism all over the world. It needs to be led by and articulated by frontline impacted communities, especially women of color, Black women, Indigenous women, people with disabilities, queer folks, and leaders from the Global South, migrant and refugee communities, and young people. And this moment of economic crisis and pandemic that we're in right now, I think, the Feminist Green New Deal Coalition has only been around for about a year, and we've really been trying to meet this moment as well, because we realized that the entrenched inequality and violence against those who are already pushed to the margins when it comes to the climate crisis, right? This comes from the same roots of white supremacy, of extractivism, of patriarchy, and of colonialism. And feminist analysis, feminist theory sees those things as always connected, right? So these systems of violence depend on each other, and a feminist approach to climate policy knows that we have to dismantle them all in tandem. We know that a feminist analysis is not just simply adding gender to the pot and stirring, though that is the approach sometimes that global policy takes, which I'll touch on in just a moment. So I would say the core piece here that will bridge these two buckets is that the Feminist Coalition for a Green New Deal in the US, though we work right now to influence and contribute to Green New Deal specific agenda setting and policy making in the US context, one of our core principles, and we have 10 core principles that all folks in the coalition endorse and sign on to, is actually verbatim recognize that there is no such thing as domestic climate policy. So one of our core organizing values, though we work really hard and diligently to influence US climate policy, we recognize that it does not end with climate policy within the US. We know that the links between foreign policy and domestic policy are inextricable, and we need to require a commitment to global justice through diplomacy, through international cooperation, and most importantly, really a recognition that the US has been the world's worst and largest historic carbon polluter, and that this introduces real questions of climate reparations and of justice. So our work with the Feminist Green New Deal Coalition in the US is really rooted in global solidarity and in recognition that the work within policymaking in the US needs to be linked with both the UNFCCC process and other processes around global climate policy and adaptation. So, of course, feminist power within the UNFCCC takes many forms, but I'll speak specifically about the work that WeDo does in another one of our collectives, and this is known as the Women and Gender Constituency, or the WGC for short. And I'll say the international convention, the UNFCCC, that influences it's a convention that influences domestic policymaking and implementation. There are so many ways to engage, right? There are so many mechanisms and pathways to participate in that space. But the WGC is an official observer constituency, which means we have particular room and opportunities within the convention to participate and to have our voices heard. And really the WGC acts as a space to collect and organize advocacy around gender justice within the climate talks. And in that space, we really work, I would say, towards a couple things. We work towards actually shifting policymaking within that space. So attempting to really directly influence the negotiations to be centered on human rights and to name women's rights within that framework. And also through this advocacy, as well as our events and our presence within the UNFCCC space more broadly, we want to really be setting normative expectations for what it means to include and participate, to include and enable participation of all peoples, but especially those who are historically marginalized and not included in these policy processes, but are also at the front lines of climate change's impacts, right? And we know that there are some successes that have certainly been won over the years, but there is so much work to be done in ensuring that approaches to climate action are centered in climate justice and gender justice. So I would say with all of that work, we also enter as movement folks, we enter the global policy space of the UNFCCC with an eye to the fact that it can be useful and strategic for us, right? We can enter that space and make powerful moments out of our relationship building, out of us meeting with advocates from all over the world, out of finding ways to build global campaigns. We keep an eye and always influence the UNFCCC process, the technical policymaking process, but we don't want to be limited to seeing that policy process as the only reason we are there and the only reason that we are building power together as global feminist movements. So the thing that I'll speak to specifically within the UNFCCC is what we call the Gender Action Plan, which is the main sort of policy victory that I would say that folks point to around the intersection of gender and climate justice at the global policy level. And the gap, there's a lot to say about the gap, and I'm happy to dive more in, but I'll just say sort of from top line info, the first Gender Action Plan was adopted by countries at COP23, so fairly recently. And it's really centered around bolstering the role of women in climate action. And then more recently at COP25, so this was only in 2019, parties agreed to a 5-year enhanced Lima work program on gender and its Gender Action Plan. And the aim of the GAP, the Gender Action Plan, is to ensure that women can influence climate change negotiations and decisions, and that men and women are represented, it's very binary, are represented equally in all aspects of the UN Climate Change Convention to really increase its effectiveness, and in recognition that it's our human rights to all be participating and represented in these processes. So the GAP sets out in 5 priority areas the activities that will help it achieve this objective, and these range from, goals around gender balance, women's leadership, capacity building, to gender responsive implementation of the convention and the Paris Agreement. And the GAP really arose from years of advocacy by the women and gender constituency and decisions that built on each other year after year as we continued to push and build power. And it was the first program of work specifically on gender that were adopted in the negotiations. So there's still much to be done, and there's a lot that needs to happen to ensure real meaningful participation of women in the global climate policy process. But if I have faith in anyone, it's the feminist activists who've been doing this work for, like I said, decades and decades. And I think we're in a really exciting moment in which we're really seeing connectivity between global feminist movements in a way that global feminist movements to global climate justice movements, I also will add, in a way that we haven't before. And I think that that's a really exciting a really exciting space for transformation on the horizon, and I'm absolutely excited to talk more about that if we want to speak to future visions. But I'll leave it there, and hope we can dive more into this really critical connection between U.S. policy and global policy that I think we work at, but also so many do as well. So really happy to be here, and thanks for listening to me, folks. I hope that I didn't drone on too long.
Mara, thank you. That was a really excellent presentation, and I learned a huge amount from what you were saying. So thank you very much. Because I'm the moderator, I get to ask some questions first, and I'm grateful to both of you that although we recognize the challenges, that you both recognize, you know, the great ideas and the hope that there is in the UN and among activists and so on, that we could still, it's not too late to address these questions. Maybe I could just start by asking, I don't know, Mara, if you want to pick this question, but could you just explain a bit the implications of this US election for the US position on climate change, and also what that would mean globally for people at the UN? And to ask both of you also, how do you assess the readiness or willingness of countries out there? Are there some good role models out there? Franz mentioned the European Union, for example. But there's some good actions and role models out there that we could look to for how we take forward the climate commitments. So maybe Mara, you want to kick off?
Sure. Well, I mean, I'm not saying anything that no one hasn't heard before, but the stakes for this election cannot be overstated. And I think there's really nothing short of the future of the planet being really on the line, and the future of, I'll actually rephrase that to say, like, the future of a livable and survivable future. And I think that if environmental justice teachings and climate justice teachings tell us anything, it's really that we need to be understanding that if we're not building futures for the most marginalized, we're not building futures for all of us. And I think when I think about the stakes of this election, I remind myself that we're already seeing the impacts of the climate crisis all around us, and the impact of this election will just be those effects magnified to degrees that we can hardly comprehend. So when I think about the ways that you know, we're seeing wildfires ravage the West, and we're seeing hurricanes hit with, you know, growing frequency and ferocity. We know what the impacts of this election and the growing climate crisis will be, and we simply just can't really imagine how much greater the ferocity and the frequency of those kinds of events, what they will look like. So we need to really fight like hell. I think that I also have, you know, I think in my work with WeDo, I think I have a growing appreciation for the ways that fascist governments, or really in the feminist movement, we often talk about macho fascist governments. So governments that have specific leaders who I think we really see as inhabiting unique places in which masculinity and white supremacy and fascism come together to produce a particular kind of violence in an individual. And I think we see that through a variety of governments, not just our own. I think when we think about Brazil, when we think about the UK, when we think about Duterte in the Philippines, you know, there are a lot of really incredible examples of the ways that fascism and masculinity combine to most clearly devastate the planet and women, and that those things are really inextricably linked. Violence against women and violence against the earth through the form of extraction and pollution and the climate crisis are really clearly connected. And we've seen what that looks like for the last 4 years very clearly in this country. So this, I have to stop myself because I think that we could go down a deep rabbit hole of what the stakes of this election are. I think that something that gives me a lot of hope and a lot of excitement is that I know the place in which there is real movement happening in the US is thinking through what the Green New Deal or anything else by the name that is just a transformative climate justice and economic justice agenda is really actually happening on the state and local level. And we're seeing real movement from particular leaders in different localities in envisioning what this looks like in their own communities. And that work will happen no matter what the outcome of this election is. There will be different challenges in our way, to be sure, but that work will continue. And I think from my end, in terms of looking to folks who are leading by example, you know, there are obviously great examples out there of folks who are doing the work of building great climate policies, but I would actually draw our attention to the ways that feminist leadership in this crisis or this way that in this moment in which crises have really compounded, so that we see how the crisis of COVID-19 is intersecting with the crisis of white supremacy around the world, is intersecting with the crisis of the climate crisis. We are seeing the ways that feminist leadership that is rooted in care, and when I say that, I mean care for people, care for the planet, care for communities, and more specifically, really investing in the care economy. So the work of caring for families, communities, people through education, healthcare, land stewardship, domestic work. All of these pieces that contribute to whether or not we are living in spaces that take care of each other, or if we are living in communities and places that really thrive and profit off of extraction and exploitation. That's where I really see the potential for incredible feminist climate leadership. And I think we can see examples of really incredible feminist leadership in this moment of COVID-19 from folks like Jacinda Ardern in New Zealand. And I would actually point folks to a really incredible leader I've been learning a lot about recently, the health minister of Kerala, the state in India. I'm blanking on her name right now. I'm so sorry, I need to look her up again. But folks who have really put care at the center of their COVID-19 response, because something that feminists have said for decades now is that care will also be at the center of a successful response to the climate crisis. We know that care work is already the greenest, most low carbon, planet-friendly work out there. And we know that right now it's also incredibly feminized, it's undervalued, it's invisibilized, and that really investment in the care economy, and like Franz is saying, while divesting from harmful institutions like the fossil fuel industry, like militarism, and instead directing those resources into land care and care for people, that's our path out of the climate crisis. That's our path towards a new gender equitable and human rights centered world. And so the feminist leadership of people in this moment, of women specifically in this moment, in responding to COVID-19 also gives me a lot of hope around what feminist leadership to the climate crisis can look like as well.
Excellent. Wow. Okay, Franz, over to you.
Well, thank you. Let me, Mara, just pick up where you left off. I couldn't agree more that the action has to be local, and it has to be political action, and it has to be across the board and across countries. Having been in diplomacy for 30 years, I have to say, sorry, but the UNFCCC process is not a good one to waste your energy on. Because it's all right, fine. But the day has only 24 hours. Diplomacy negotiates formulations, negotiates words, negotiates resolutions for decades and decades and makes compromises, but it does not actually enforce. And so if we were now in 1988 or in 1990, so 30 years ago, when the CO2 particles in the world, in the atmosphere would not be 450 parts per million, but 320, or it was probably 340 then. Yes, more energy in the diplomatic process, but at this point in time, I think the energy has to go into the Green New Deal, whether it's in the US or in Europe, it's called the Green Deal, not the Green New Deal. UNFCCC, even if every country were to do what they have promised, which they are not, we would be living in hell because temperature would overshoot the 2 degrees. So that process, okay, but with a grain of salt. In the US, I mean, the organizers sent around this most interesting resolution of the UN Human Rights Council 38.4 of July 2018. I don't know whether you realize that this resolution was passed by the Human Rights Council 2 weeks after the US quit the Human Rights Council, calling it a cesspool of political bias. Quitting diplomatic institutions is often done either directly walking out. You will not know this, but I'm telling you, today, 87 years ago, namely on the 14th of October 1933, Germany, Hitler, walked out of the League of Nations. And there was no prize. So the action has to be, frankly, in the economy. It has to be with conservative people. It has to be to convince banks that the fossil fuel industry is stranded assets, you're losing money, that in social services, healthcare systems, employment's good wages, it's actually in the interest of business if you want to sell something also the day after tomorrow, not just today. So we have to understand that action today is still national. Britain has done interesting stuff, for example, putting a price on coal, and has almost eliminated coal from electricity production. A lot of the work has to be, it's hard technical work. In Germany, for example, we have to force the government to impose speed limits on the Autobahn, which is incredibly hard. It's like telling Americans that they cannot have guns, 14th Amendment, whatever. I'm part of a group of scientists called Scientists for Future, supporting the Fridays for Future movement. And we are just working hard. Germany runs the European Union for the second half of 2020. Because while, Sarah, to answer your question, the EU deal is one of the best in the world, but it is woefully inadequate. So the question is, what is the standard? Is it better than Russia? Of course. Is it better than Turkey? Yes. Is it better than Brazil? Yes. But it's better than the US. But these are terrible standards. It will not save coming generations, because what we're doing, I have groped for a long time how to picture the political situation where we are. And the only one I have come up with, Mara, I hope you're not angry with me, is of a pregnant woman who continues to smoke and to drink. In other words, a person who, to live, to exercise rights, will compromise something for the future. So this is, you do it to yourself, but you're also responsible for the child. You know, a passive smoker in a restaurant is very different because you can walk out, but the child cannot leave. And so our way of life endangers the future generations. It endangers people in other parts of the world, like in Africa, that have contributed nothing to the problem. It endangers other species, and it endangers nature. So we decide what we want without regard to nature, other species, future generations. And so to counter also the argument that environment and jobs are in contradiction. So it can be either or. No, it has to be both. To rebuild after COVID, this current fossil fuel dependent flight to Florida for $80 or from Berlin to Athens for the weekend for €75 is ruinous for the future. So to conclude, the process, as far as I can see, has to be local, and that's why this election now in November, not only presidential, but also for the Senate races, you know, there is one scientist running for the US Senate, a woman in Wyoming, a climatologist. I have to send you her spot. It's so, she has all these pictures of all these men who are saying, I'm not a scientist, I'm not a scientist. And then she says, but I'm a scientist. And she thinks that she needs only to swing 56,000 votes, and then she can be a senator from Wyoming and bring the science perspective. So what this woman is doing, fighting locally, what people on the ground are doing, and once, Mara, the other side has won the US government, we can make sure that the State Department negotiates better at UNFCCC and leads. So we need a benevolent hegemon, and I hope very much that the US can be it, together with the European Union, and then with China, because the future can only be secured if those three players, the US, China, and the EU, are on one side. Then all the others have to fall in line. But if one of the three is not there, it's not going to work. Thanks.
Thank you. That's excellent. And I think a big takeaway from what you're both saying is just how important it is for people in the USA and the other key countries to mobilize and be involved and push from the ground up for that change. I know that now it's 7 o'clock, we were going to move to Q&A, and Joya was going to come in and just share some questions that the audience has with us. Joya, are you ready, or shall I ask another? Because I have a million questions. So are you ready with some questions from the chat?
I don't see any yet. So maybe if you want to ask one more question, and then we'll give folks a little more time to think of some for
yeah. Fantastic. Yeah. Okay. So one, and yeah, just put your questions in the chat function, folks. So big question that we had in preparing for this talk was about, you know, the most vulnerable and the most marginalized people who may be, you know, the most exposed to the effects of climate change and therefore to forced migration and to various other, you know, humanitarian crises that the climate change may bring about. So one question I had was, you know, how prepared are we, or how prepared are the countries that are most likely to be affected to deal with some of the worst fallout? And what might the humanitarian crisis look like? And what kind of humanitarian system should we be building now? My other question was around, you know, if people want to get involved, people watching now, if they want to get involved and make a difference, what kinds of national and international organizations would you recommend to them that they could join or follow? Maybe since Mara kicked off last time, Franz, you want to kick off, and then Mara? Can you unmute, Franz?
Sorry, I had a problem. I think Mara should go first, please. I had lots to say, but I would like to hear.
Okay.
Because we're talking mainly, I guess, to people who are U.S. New York Americans, and so because I could, of course, also say much about to people if there are participants interested in European institutions?
Sure. So I'll try to tie together a few thoughts here. So I think I want to comment quickly on the thread that was that we were pulling before in the last question. I think it's important for me to say that I and WeDo, and I would say I'll be so bold as to say that I think feminist movements more broadly definitely do not ascribe to the idea that that humans all over the world are just consciously sentencing the next generations to lives of huge climate challenges and human rights abuses without knowing so. So with all due respect, Franz, I kind of reject the metaphor that you used there, because, you know, feminist movements and WeDo and myself, we are much more inclined, and I think often are some of the first to say, we know who the enemies are. We know who the specific industries and individuals who are blocking climate action are, and we know what the blockades to progress are. We know that the vast majority of people around the planet and in the US know that we are in the midst of a climate crisis, want action, and know that the people who have contributed least to the problem are not the people in charge. And so we're not achieving the kind of progress we need. And I think to tie this into your last question, there are so many people-powered movements right now who are doing the work of calling out the enemy and achieving change by building broad-based, multiracial, cross-class, multi-generational coalitions of folks who are saying, there are a few specific older white men who are the owners of incredibly powerful fossil fuel industries, military industrial industries, and petrochemical industries, and a few other industries that we would really put into also carceral industries, folks who are really benefiting from the most exploitative and the most extractive kinds of profit-driven, planet-destroying industries out there, who have benefited off an old Southern strategy that uses white supremacy and class hatred to weaponize the fact that they are making billions off of the climate crisis and dividing all of us. So I think the first place I would tell folks to go is, if you're a young person, find a youth-led climate movement that is in your community who is doing this work. I'm a member of Sunrise movement, and Sunrise is really placing at the center both a really unapologetic and unashamed story of the truth of who the enemy is and what stands in our way. And Sunrise movement calls those the fossil fuel billionaires that stand in the way of building a future in which all people have a chance at breathing clean air, drinking clean water, and having a home and human rights that are promised to them. And so I think for me as an activist and as someone who is rooted in movement, like I said at the beginning, policy is one tool. Policy is always behind movements. Movements will always lead the way. There is no progressive policy that I can point to in the history of this country that came without movement leaders being at the forefront of demanding it and saying, this is what we need. And I think we can see which movement politicians in the US right now, but I would probably argue around the world as well, are really putting forth proposals and policies that are rooted in movement demands. And then to try to tie in, I hope this isn't too disparate, too many disparate thoughts that I'm trying to tie together, but to your first question about around, are we prepared? And the answer is, are policymakers prepared? Absolutely not. But you know, something that the Feminist Coalition for a Green New Deal and feminist and climate justice movement folks have said forever are that the folks who are, to borrow a phrase from Congresswoman Ayanna Pressley, those who are closest to the pain need to be closest to the power, right? Folks who are the most marginalized by the climate crisis, but also we know if you're most marginalized by the climate crisis, you're also probably most marginalized by racial injustice, by economic injustice, by the health crisis right now, et cetera. Those folks in those communities too often actually also have the solutions, and they have an idea of what they need to live a life that is free from those kinds of harms. And they have not been silent about it. You know, folks who are on the front lines of the climate crisis have said for many years what kinds of changes they need, what kinds of industries they want out of their communities, what kinds of investment they want in their communities to make life fair and to make life just. So I think policymakers are not equipped at all for the kinds of huge changes that the climate crisis and these intersecting crises will bring in the next few years, next decades. But I don't think that the answer then is that we don't have the solutions, because we do have the solutions. Indigenous people have the solutions, frontline communities have the solutions, and they've been saying them for generations. So I think it's just really time that we listen.
I am puzzled that the election that will happen in the US in 3 weeks is still touch and go. One doesn't know how it will end. I hope very much that what I'm reading, that it'll be a landslide and that the Democrats will take the Senate and the House and the White House, but I'm not sure. Politics is incredibly difficult, and Mara, I can understand what you're saying, and you're probably right to some extent about old white men, fossil fuel industry, and so on. But don't forget, you have also lots of people in America and Europe who are enjoying the lifestyle or who are not willing to give up. Each American emits 17 tons of carbon dioxide per year. In Europe, it is 7. In India, it is 2. And in Ghana, it is 0.3. To reduce this, you would have to have smaller houses, less car, less urban sprawl, less jobs, less big cars. So to get concrete, that's why Kamala Harris, Biden are not even agreeing that they would give up one of the most dangerous, polluting, unnecessary things, namely fracking. So I am concerned that in Germany, it is the car workers that want to sell Mercedes and sell them to China with internal combustion engine. And they might vote green, and they might even say, I'm not eating meat and I'm recycling plastic, but only so far. We have about a decade, humanity has about a decade to avoid the worst in terms of climate catastrophe. I don't see anywhere in the world realistically green people taking over. What I can see is pressure groups, and you mentioned a few, and I wish you a lot of luck and a lot of success, and that you put up people that they will run for office and that they will swing majorities. In America, for example, 350.org, I find, is doing extremely good work. In Europe, in Germany, for example, Fridays for Future is doing extremely good work organizing thousands of people. So there are coalitions, but there are also green politicians who are still building highways for whatever reason. So what can we do? And there was a question also in the chat box. There are so many tools and we have to use them all. We have to use divestment. We have to use legal action. The attorneys general of New York and some other states have actually sued Exxon and the fossil fuel industry, not for polluting, I mean, it is like suing Al Capone for tax evasion. They are suing him. They have sued Exxon for misleading shareholders by not being clear about the risks in terms of investment, return on investments if you have stranded assets. The Attorney General says Exxon is overvaluing its asset, and that is under financial rules not allowed. So legal action against plastic polluters, against meat industry, against the fossil fuel industry, against the whole lot is another one. Action directly against pollution, closing parking lots, getting bike paths. It would have the additional benefit that people are healthier and so on. So there is a huge amount where community action will make life concretely different and better, and will particularly, I think it was Frederick Douglass who said that power only yields to pressure. And that means politicians have to fear that they will lose their seat. Republicans will have to feel that in Texas and in South Carolina and elsewhere. Not necessarily in New York. But so that's where the action has to be for the next 10 years. And when you have a discussion, yesterday in the New York Times, Amazon is building a huge plant, a good distribution center in France, in the Rhone Valley. And there are even green politicians, jobs right now, or preserving the environments, not having trucks go through, not having the landscape. And so some of them say, if you don't give us jobs because we're destitute, we'll vote against you. So it's complicated, but pressures have to be built on the political system that we have to change its direction in the short time that we still have available. Thank you.
Thank you, Mara and Franz, for really enlightening responses. Joya, do you want to come in with any questions from the chat?
I think that Franz might have started answering this question, but I'll read it aloud to see if he has any more comments or if Mara wants to comment on it as well. Somebody asked, as resolutions are non-binding in many ways, is, as Franz said, a benevolent hegemon and coalition the only way to actually make progress, or are there legal or more actionable avenues that can be taken for more immediate results in terms of international results?
Sarah, why don't you give it a go?
No, I was actually just going to offer to you, Franz. Do you want to continue your thoughts since you are all already sort of building on this, and then I'll come in?
No. I don't want to take more time. Maybe I'll respond, but also, I mean, Sarah, the question I think is a little bit also not addressed to you, but I would be curious in your thoughts. You know, you have worked a lot in non-binding resolution work, and I'm not dismissing them as completely useless. No, they are very useful. And I'm a defender of the UN institutions, because only if you have norms and people are not living up to them, can you hold them accountable and can you shame them. But one can't override, one shouldn't overrate it either, not underrated, but also not overrated. But what other mechanism to leverage, Sarah, do you see?
I can come in quickly and then pass to Mara. So, I mean, I suppose in international development, you know, voluntary and non-binding frameworks have really been the norm for how countries have cooperated with one another. And I suppose the advantage of working in that way is that it gives you some kind of common language and legitimate basis to define your partnership. And so I could see how climate norms and non-binding resolutions would eventually filter into the way that development and humanitarian organizations work. It's had some effect on global, multinational corporations as well, who tend to be aware of their reputations and want to be seen to be upholding certain UN standards and norms. And I suppose we saw that a bit in the USA. The previous administration did a big consultation to define the US goals, and various US companies were involved in that. So I suppose the point with norms and non-binding resolutions is that it kind of shifts the dialogue and the expectations and the culture a bit around, what policy should be and what ideal standards should be, but it's certainly not a magic bullet. I think a big issue is accountability in international frameworks. The more possibility there is to hold different countries to account and to explain in very clear ways who is and isn't succeeding and contributing, I think does make a difference. For example, with China, we'll see whether Xi's announcement was a cynical announcement or a true commitment. But he obviously felt that there was a national advantage for China to make this very kind of bold statement. And I think that's where you might see things shift. Likewise, if the EU and China really do what they say they're going to do, again, that changes incentives inside the USA among some of the more powerful groups that we're talking about, because they don't want to be left behind in, developing alternative energy sources and selling these things around the world and having the patents and so on. So I think there's a role, although it's no panacea, but I think there is a role for diplomats and activists to keep plugging away at trying to, open up the space around norms. But I'll hand over to Mara as well for your thoughts.
Well, I guess, yeah, thank you for that, Sarah. And I would just say, yeah, I suppose that I would say a couple things. One, I think I would problematize what we mean by progress in the question. I mean, there are certainly ways that like a single actor or a single country can make progress towards, for example, lowering global carbon emissions. Is that progress necessarily for the most marginalized? I think, are there ways that their immediate needs around climate finance and adaptation funds and building infrastructure that will help them survive the worst and the first climate impacts, are those necessarily progress for them? Maybe not. So I think for me, multilateralism rejects the idea that there can be sort of one benevolent hegemon who acts as the savior or who achieves progress on their own. I think that a real global coalition is the only way to not only meet global emissions reductions needs, but also, for example, meet the very real demands of global climate finance. We're not going to be able to fund the necessary economic transformation of the entire world, but most importantly of folks who are on the front lines of the climate crisis, countries in the global south, without all of the countries who have historically contributed the most to the climate crisis paying their fair share. And even if one of those countries decides that they will pay what they committed to, for example, the GCF, it's not going to be enough until it's all of them. And I would say that it's not going to be enough until it's all of them paying more than they initially committed, which is nowhere near enough. So I think there's degrees of progress, right? There are ways that that single actors or small coalitions can make progress in some ways, but it's not necessarily progress for all. And I would say that we can't consider progress true progress if it's only saving the folks who are most far away from harm's way anyway. And then second, I would just say, I'll be the organizer who says the way that immediate results are achieved is through direct action. I think we've seen not only through the last few years of truly unprecedented youth climate strikes around the world, but also this summer's and this year's global uprisings against white supremacy, literally overnight, norms changing around what kind of action from federal governments, whether it is around climate justice or climate policy or policy around race and racial justice, what seems normal and what seems acceptable and what seems necessary. And I mean, yeah, this feels also obviously top of mind with the election coming up. You know, we have folks who are scenario planning for all kinds of possible results on election day. And I will say that the greatest hope I have lies in the folks who are recognizing that direct action will be one of our most important tools that day. And that there is no greater tool for change around the world and throughout history than having mass movements of people in the streets demanding a fair and just future for whatever they are fighting for. So, you know, for me, I'm really rooted in the ways that youth movements and the ways that these global strikes have really changed the norms. And I think we see that looking slightly differently in different countries. And I think, you know, we're seeing like the youth climate movements in Europe take on this very traditional labor style strike in which, you know, in the US, we kind of have seen like a couple times a year, these big strikes in which hundreds of thousands of kids are walking out on Fridays. But in Europe, there are really much more sort of traditional labor tactics being used of kids walking out every single Friday. Of every single Friday, there being this total abandonment of the only labor that kids can withhold, them going to school, right? And so I think when we have those kinds of actions, what seems possible really changes. What was seen as impossible might be possible. And so, though I agree that there are so many different tools around legal action and global policy processes and national policy processes, I'll put my money on mass movements and people in the streets, but recognize we need all of those.
Thank you. I think we've got time for one more question, which we could answer very quickly before we have to close. Of course, I have a million questions, so I don't know, Joy, if there are any more questions in the chat.
So there is one more. It's about climate reparations, which I think you both have touched upon. So the student says, this is the first I have heard of this idea of potential reparations of certain countries for their heavier responsibility for the demise of our planet. Is this a popular idea in the climate policy space? And what would these types of reparations look like?
Okay, thank you. Well, Mara, you mentioned this. Would you like to kick off and then Franz?
Sure, I'll just say shortly. I feel like I've talked a lot, sorry. I feel like there's so much to say about climate reparations, and I would certainly tell folks to spend some time digging into the research and the wisdom of so many folks who've been pushing on the idea of reparations. I think reparations exists in a lot of different forms, and climate reparations obviously builds off many other forms of reparations that have existed around the world and in different countries based on different historical harms and forms of violence. I would say there's a lot of different pieces to this. I would say to the part about it being popular, I think it's probably exactly what you would admit. It's not popular with the countries who would have to pay the reparations, and it's really popular among the folks who know that they are owed those reparations. So namely activists and movement leaders in the global South have, and I would say folks within the US who are pushing for climate justice and who are frontline communities, have also been at the forefront of pushing for climate reparations, knowing that those exist within national levels as well. So there are ways that folks within the US who are on the forefront of climate impacts are owed money for the ways that they have been displaced and marginalized and forced to move and forced to relocate and forced to take on new jobs because of the fossil fuel industry, for example, or because the climate crisis is eroding their home, their traditional homelands on the coast, et cetera. And I would just tell folks, if you're interested in looking up like one specific piece of this, I would look more into loss and damage. That's a framework that is being really pushed by countries in the Global South, particularly Pacific and small island developing states, SIDS for short, who are obviously on the forefront of the climate crisis, but also at the forefront of proposing solutions. And loss and damage has been a really key sticking point for folks who have contributed most to the climate crisis, impeding on the progress in those discussions. And loss and damage is really, really key to not lose in the conversation. And COP and the UNFCCC is one of the spaces in which that conversation is most powerfully had. So would look up loss and damage, but it's a broad range of things that are really interesting and folks should definitely dive into, because it's a matter of justice. I'll leave it there.
Sarah, you started out by, when you were talking about your professional experience about the developed northern countries being very concerned and hardline about litigation, fearing to be sued. And that is, of course, exactly the reparation kind of idea. It has seeped into the discussion, into the climate discussion from the very beginning, with the concept of common but differentiated responsibilities, namely that Europe and North America and Japan are mainly responsible for the stock of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. Now, for the flow of what comes in today, others also, but we are responsible for the stock. And there's often the image used of the bathtub and the drain blocked. And so what is in the bathtub that is 3/4 full, this is what Europe and North America and Japan and Australia have put in over the last 200 years. And the faucet gushing water still in, these are current emissions. But the responsibility is not just what flows in today, but what is in there already. And this is what has to be talked about now. Of course, from a philosophical point of view, whether people living today can be made to pay for what their great-grandparents did is an interesting question. But it was recognized, and Mara, you are right, and you pointed at UNFCCC in the COP discussions, that is the idea of the Green Climate Fund, namely that there is some restitution, they could not call it reparation, that the damage caused by our lifestyle, where we are today, has to be somehow, monies have to be paid. So $100 billion a year, of course, it's terribly underfunded. And I don't want to delve into it, but I would only point to two very strong discussions in that context. Because is the money, when it is there, will it be used to help countries in the global south to adapt to global heating? Or is the money to be spent to prevent further global heating? So there are intensive discussions, and it's not a clear better or worse or moral or immoral. You have only so much money, and are you spending it on mitigation or on adaptation? I would like to say, Sarah, to your question about China, I hope very much that China is sincere for their own sake. China is now the largest producer of solar cells. They understand, and China doesn't have any oil, so they have to import it. You know, the comparative advantage of renewables is so evident. You do not have dirty oil wells off the coast in Texas, refineries in Houston, trucks that bring the stuff, and then you have gas stations, but you actually have it on your roof. And you don't have any spills, and you don't have, I mean, it is so elegant. And that's why, of course, the fossil fuel industry is fighting it, because they want to sell every week another tank full of gas. And so the renewables, also electric cars, weigh half of the internal combustion engine, have no movable parts, are maintenance free, and so on and so forth. So it's win-win-win. And so we are fighting something that is evident, but of course the people, the forces of the status quo, both the workers and the owners and the shareholders and the banks and the dealers, they are invested in the status quo. Now China, I think, will do both, I hope, in their self-interest, and will do what I think Europe should be doing, or the US, become world leaders in renewable technology. And they're going to do it, and they'll test it for themselves. The big issue, the big open question is that China, in this commitment that Xi Jinping said on the 22nd of September, that China will reach peak power only in 2030. So they will increase polluting for another 10 years. And that is politically understandable, but whether nature can accept that, nature doesn't negotiate, nature doesn't compromise, nature doesn't give a hoot. And so that element that China will keep polluting for 10 years is a bit like St. Augustine, make me chaste, but not quite yet, Lord. So we'll have to see about that. Anyway, thanks so much for me.
Well, thank you. And unfortunately, we are going to have to bring this discussion to a close, even though I think it's been fantastic, a really rich discussion. And I think it's a huge amount of knowledge and understanding for us, but also a call to action, what we can all do. So thank you very much. I'm going to hand over to Joya now, who will make the closing remarks. But of course, I think we as the panel would like to thank the students from the Alliance for Climate Change and Environment and the International Policy and Planning Association for this opportunity. It's been a great discussion. So thank you, and over to you, Joya.
Yeah, I mean, really, I just wanted to thank you all for taking the time, and thank you from ACE and IPPA. I know that nowadays it can be a little hard to stay on Zoom all day, but this has been, like you said, such a rich discussion. I think I know I'm leaving it with a lot of things I'm going to research and look up, and I hope that everyone who watches it now and watches the recording does the same thing. So hope everyone has a wonderful rest of the evening.
Okay. Thank you all. Thanks
all.
for organizing it, and good discussion. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Have a good one. Bye.
Yeah. So Joya, I see you next Wednesday.
Yes, I'll be there.
We continue the discussion. Okay. Very good. Take care. All the best.